Imagine a monster so terrifying, so colossal, that the world believed it was real for generations, yet in truth, it was a creature stitched together from errors, pride, and guesswork. It stood in museums, filled the imaginations of children, and became an icon of prehistory. But it was never truly born of nature. It was born of mistakes. This is the story of the prehistoric monster built not by evolution, but by human hands and human error. Before we dive into its strange journey, take a moment to subscribe, so you don't miss more stories of extinct animals, forgotten worlds, and the incredible ways science shapes legends out of bones. The 19th century was a time of discovery, but also chaos. Across the Badlands of America, fossils were emerging in astonishing numbers. Skeletons of giants no one had ever seen before were pulled from the rock, carried eastward to laboratories and museums. But paleontology was still a young science. Fragile and desperate, the scientists racing to interpret these fossils didn't have the tools we rely on today. They didn't have DNA, advanced imaging, or even enough comparative skeletons to check their work. They had fragments of bone, scattered across vast deserts. And from those fragments they had to rebuild lost worlds. And sometimes they got it horribly wrong. One of the greatest mistakes was the invention of Brontosaurus, the thunder lizard. In 1879, paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh uncovered a nearly complete skeleton. But something was missing: the skull. Marsh, eager to publish before his rival Edward Drinker Cope, filled the gap with a skull from another dinosaur entirely. The result was an animal that never existed in life, a chimera, part Apatosaurus, part Camarasaurus, held together by ambition and pride. Marsh named it Brontosaurus, and the world embraced it. For decades, Brontosaurus was displayed in museums, painted in books, and marched across Hollywood screens. It became the symbol of dinosaurs themselves. A towering monster with a long neck and thunderous tail. But it was a lie, built from mismatched bones. By the early 20th century, paleontologists admitted the truth: Brontosaurus was not real. The skeleton belonged to Apatosaurus, a dinosaur Marsh had already described. The thunder lizard was nothing more than a double-N accident enshrined in stone. Yet the mistake didn't end there. Brontosaurus was imagined as a sluggish swamp dweller, its immense body too heavy to walk on land. Scientists believed these giants lived in water to support their weight, dragging their tails like useless anchors. Illustrations showed them half-submerged, gasping in swamps, doomed by their own size. But this too was wrong. Later research revealed sauropods were perfectly adapted for land. Their limbs were strong pillars, their lungs efficient, their tails powerful counterbalances. They were not clumsy failures, they were survivors, rulers of their time. This pattern of error repeats itself throughout paleontology. Paleontolosaurus, a marine reptile with a long neck, was once reconstructed with its head on its tail. Cope's mistake became infamous, exposed by Marsh, a humiliation that haunted him for the rest of his life. Megalosaurus, the first dinosaur ever named, was rebuilt as a giant four-legged lizard, a monstrous dragon crawling on its belly. In truth, it was a fierce bipedal predator, far closer to the image of T. Rex. And then there was Iguanodon, imagined with a horn on its nose. The horn was actually a thumb spike, but for decades, statues and textbooks showed a dinosaur that never existed. These mistakes weren't lies, they were the best guesses of scientists working in the dark. But they created monsters that filled the world's imagination, monsters born from error. The prehistoric monster built from mistakes was not one creature, but many, each error layered on the next, until museums became graveyards of myths. Children stared up at creatures that had never walked the earth. They marveled at inventions, not discoveries. And in their own way, those inventions became just as powerful as the truth. But perhaps the strangest twist of all is that sometimes mistakes come back to life. Just when Brontosaurus seemed banished forever, new research in 2015 suggested it might actually be distinct from Apatosaurus after all. The dinosaur once dismissed as a myth was suddenly restored. Walking the halls of science again, the monster built from mistakes had, in a way, become real. For more than a century, the world lived with monsters born of error. They filled books, films, and imaginations, shaping the way we saw prehistory. But in truth, they tell us as much about ourselves as they do about dinosaurs. Because every mistake reveals the hunger to know, to explain, to give form to the fragments left behind. And in that hunger, we sometimes build creatures that shouldn't exist. Take the Neanderthals. When their skulls were first discovered, scientists reconstructed them as brutish savages, hunched and barely human, for generations. They were depicted as grunting cave dwellers, a failed species destined to vanish, but this image was wrong. Modern research reveals Neanderthals were intelligent, skilled hunters, artists, and survivors. They buried their dead, crafted tools, and may have spoken complex language. The brutish caricature was a mistake, but it became an enduring monster in our cultural imagination. Or consider the mastodon. Once thought to be a vicious carnivore because of its massive teeth, early scientists imagined it slashing prey, a terrifying predator. In truth, it was a peaceful plant eater, an ancestor of elephants. The Glyptodon, a giant armadillo, was mistaken for a massive turtle. Farmers even used its fossil shells as roofs, convinced they were ancient tortoise remains, again and again. Mistakes gave birth to monsters. The story of these errors is not about failure, it is about growth. Every time science was wrong, it forced scientists to look closer, to ask better questions, to refine their methods. The wrong skull on Brontosaurus led to debates that pushed paleontology forward. The backward Elasmosaurus taught scientists to study anatomy more carefully. The brutish Neanderthal stereotype forced anthropology to expand its view of humanity. Mistakes became milestones, and the monsters they created became teachers. And yet, even as science advances, we must accept that some of today's reconstructions will one day be mistakes too. The feathered velociraptor, the swimming Spinosaurus. The colors we assign to dinosaurs, these are all guesses, based on the best evidence we have now. In 100 years, they may look as wrong as the horned iguanodon. That is the nature of science, always changing, always correcting itself, always building new monsters from old mistakes. The prehistoric monster built from mistakes is not a single dinosaur, but the shadow of our own imagination. It is the Brontosaurus that never was, the swamp-dwelling sauropods, the backward Elasmosaurus, the brutish Neanderthal. It is every error that became a legend, every misstep that inspired wonder. And it reminds us that the line between truth and myth is thin, shifting with every new discovery. Imagine standing in a museum today, looking up at a towering skeleton. You read the plaque, you trust the reconstruction, you believe you are looking at the truth. But behind every display is a history of revisions, corrections, and mistakes. The creature before you may be real, or it may be tomorrow's ghost. Another monster that science will one day admit was never quite right, and perhaps that is the most fascinating part of all. Because if science can turn mistakes into monsters, it means the story of the past is still alive. The bones in the ground are not silent, they are puzzles, waiting for us to put them together. Even if we get it wrong, and in those errors, and those imagined creatures, we glimpse both the fragility of knowledge and the power of curiosity. So the next time you hear the name of a dinosaur, remember, it may not be what you think. It may be a chimera, a legend, a mistake. But that doesn't make it less important. Because the monsters built from mistakes are not failures. They are proof that even when we stumble, we are still moving forward, still reaching for the truth hidden in stone. And sometimes, just sometimes, the creature that shouldn't exist finds a way to return, walking once again out of the shadows of error into the light of discovery.